Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you all for attending the Public Safety, Traffic, and Pedestrian Safety Special Committee. This afternoon, we are gathering to discuss what to do about folks that are standing in the medians and on the sides of streets and what we can do as a city to help ensure that both pedestrians and motorists are safe. My name is Brennan Jensen. I'm the deputy mayor, and I am the de facto chair until we vote momentarily. I'd like to start, and we'll just go around the room and introduce everybody. If we could start over here, if you would please. Just introduce yourself and where you're from.
I'm Bill Persinger. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Vallejo Behavioral Health Care here in Topeka and Shawnee County.
Barry Feeker, Executive Director of Topeka Rescue Mission.
Aaron Jones, I'm a second shift lieutenant.
Mike Lester, Councilman, District 9.
And I'm Brendan Jensen, Deputy Mayor and the Councilman from District 6.
Craig Duke, Fire Chief.
I'm Brian Cole. I'm the Director with the Shawnee County Department of Corrections.
Mike Padilla, Councilman, District 5.
One of the exciting things about this committee is our ability to pull in folks from all across our community, from the county, from the nonprofit sector, from the police and fire departments. This is really an incredible opportunity for us to take a deep dive as a special committee into trying to solve a very complex problem. And I'm incredibly grateful for the folks that have taken time out of their incredibly busy schedules to join us in this important endeavor. So with that, we will move to the election of a committee chair. If there are no other folks that are interested in doing that, that duty will fall to me. So if you don't want to put up with me for the duration of this project, we would need a volunteer.
So are you by default?
I am by default as the ranking member.
I vote for the default.
I love it.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Hooray. Well, with that, yeah, I do not see the city manager in here yet, so Luther Gagne has graciously agreed to give us a bit of an overview of essentially what the ordinance was, what we're trying to work through as we begin discussions on this, so I'll turn it over to him for a brief presentation. Maybe. If you need some more time, we can have the city manager speak first, if that would help. Okay. Seeing that the city manager has just arrived, if you would like to give a few remarks to the committee. You're on the agenda.
I think she's following up on something.
Well, I think for me, as we look at this, obviously it's a complex issue that needs a lot of attention from the standpoint of a review and proper looking at the various impacts that this kind of a change would occur. From that standpoint, I think that this good cross-section, I'm excited to see what they can produce. And as far as we go forward as staff, or other issues are needed, we'll be sure and present them as requested by the committee, and here to support you as you move through this process.
Thank you. Any luck? Excellent. We'll now turn it over to Luther for a brief presentation on the ordinance. And I will say the initial proposed ordinance, because it's entirely subject to the changes of this committee.
For anybody that doesn't know me, I'm Luther Gagne. I am an assistant city attorney in the legal department. I'm also assigned as the legal advisor for the police department. What I'm going to go through with you is just a brief overview of the ordinance, a little bit of how we put it together and what the ordinance actually does. This is the same presentation that was given at the council meeting, so some of you may have seen this before. When we began looking at this, we got this idea from Wichita has an ordinance that's very similar to this. And we began by looking at our crash data on what locations around the city do we have the highest number of accidents and injury accidents. And every year we put a list together. Sometimes the media requests that list and runs a story about it, but top 10 locations. For overall crashes, these are the intersections with the highest number of crashes. And many of these are the same locations, but the top 10 list for the highest number of injuries and fatalities. And that's from a period of 2010 to 2016. Now, this next chart is just looking at the data from these that went into putting together this top 10 list. This is all accidents, vehicle on vehicle, vehicle, pedestrian, whatever. This next series of charts, what we did is started trying to pull out these accidents that involve pedestrians. And over that same period of time, 2010 to 2016, and then for the year 2017, we supplemented those with our own reports, looking as best we could tell from within the department, looking at accident reports. And some of that had to do with reporting to KDOT and the availability of statistics and stuff like that. But overall, what we saw was over that 7-year period is kind of an increase in the number of pedestrian accidents. And as you would expect, you have a car versus a pedestrian in an accident. Almost all of those are going to be injuries. So that's very similar numbers. Again, representing an increase in a trend across that time period. This one is a little erratic just because there's such a small number, but this one was just looking at pedestrian fatalities. And it is up and down, mainly because it's such a small pool. There's not very many of them. Now, with that type of approach, what we started doing is trying to identify applying those statistics to the locations and trying to work it into some type of ordinance. And the way we did this was designate 2 different terms. There's an arterial street and a congested area. And both of those mean very specific things in the ordinance. They're set out with definitions. And by an arterial street, we mean that list of streets that you can see up there. And the way we came up with that list of numbers, if we go in and start plotting pinpoints on a map of where all of those accidents happen, these are the locations that had the most accidents. Congested area, it's a lot like an arterial street, but we can't single out one specific street that has a high number of accidents. It's more of a geographical area. And applying the statistics, there was a fairly significant cluster of accidents generally centered around the downtown area. So that's how we came up with the designation of that area as a congested area. And the definitions that you see up there are just the boundaries for it. There's actually 2 congested areas. In a minute, I'll show you a map. And the reason why there's 2 of them is mainly just because of having to draw a box on the map. It wasn't easy to do, so it was more clearly identified the area that we were talking about by drawing 2 boxes instead of this weird shaped thing on the map. Now, designated roadway, the ordinance talks about that in terms of what a pedestrian can do, where they can stand, where they can be, and it defines that in terms of the designated roadway, and by that we're talking about roadways, shoulders, center islands, right-of-ways or medians, and it only applies to arterial streets and congested areas. So what we've done is we're limiting where this ordinance is going to apply to only those streets and congested areas that we identify on the map. And that's a little hard to read, but I apologize for that, but that's kind of what the map looks like if you take that and put it on a map. The yellow lines are the arterial streets, and the blue and the green shaded areas are the congested areas. And again, the way those streets and areas weren't picked at random. Those were matching up to accident data that we looked at and plotted those locations of the accident on a map to come up with what these streets are. So what is actually prohibited? It makes it unlawful for any person to go upon any designated roadway or remain alongside a designated roadway, and approach a stopped vehicle or attempt to attract the attention of a driver or occupant for the purpose of inducing the driver of the vehicle to stop or slow in order to facilitate a transfer. That's a mouthful. And it's complicated because it's a very specific activity that this ordinance is talking about. It's a person standing on or in the roadway or on the median or on beside it, doing some type of activity to get the attention of a driver in order to facilitate an exchange between that driver and the pedestrian. Second, yeah.
No, please.
Okay. I was just going to say, on that back slide, that last statement, is that supposed to be in the driver or occupant of the vehicle instead of occupant?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
That's a typo, driver or occupant.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
Does the same apply if the driver's trying to get the attention of a person on the roadway? Does it work both ways?
It does.
Okay.
And I'll get to that in a second, but this is meant to penalize both drivers and pedestrians. It's that conduct is what the ordinance is looking
One
at.
more quick question, and maybe I missed it. Is an alley considered to be a designated roadway within a congested area?
No.
It mentions shoulders, islands.
Within a congested area, the alley is not included. Parking lots are not included or anything like that. It would just be the main city streets.
Can we make a note of that for
Alleys.
future reference? I'm not sure if it's going to relate to any of our discussions or not, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. And then for the designated roadway, an alley wouldn't count because the designated roadway is only that roadway itself.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the clarification.
Yeah.
Another clarification, in an area as well, if the individual pulls over to a place and parks that is legal parking, how do we differentiate between that, or would that be okay? The only reason I ask that is in some of the residential areas, if an individual is pulling over to drop off lunch for their son or daughter and pulls over off of, Frazier, pulls over to the side, parks his car, puts it in park, and somebody comes out of the house. Obviously, that's not something that we're trying to.
No, and I don't believe this ordinance would be so broad as to cover that situation where somebody pulls over and parks. That's not what we're after.
Right, I just want to make sure, clarify.
No, it wouldn't.
Thank you.
The second thing it does is prohibits anybody from standing on the median of one of those designated roadways unless the person is actually in the process of crossing the street. What this is talking about is those center islands on either a designated roadway, an arterial street. Pardon me just a second. I said a designated roadway. What I meant to say is arterial street. Either on an arterial street or within that congested area, this would prohibit anybody from standing on those center medians. And then the third one, this one actually has a little bit broader application. This one is not just arterial or congested area. This would apply citywide. And this is making it unlawful for a pedestrian to activate repeatedly a crosswalk signal for a purpose other than to stop traffic to allow them to cross the roadway. It would be considered a violation if they remain on the median through 2 consecutive cycles.
Can I ask you a quick question about that?
Sure.
I don't know if this is common anymore, at least in Topeka, but when I grew up, we used to have crossing guards where volunteers would go stand and they would stop traffic deliberately for school children to cross. And they would proceed to do that through multiple cycles. Now, granted, there were people crossing the road, but how would this apply to a situation similar to that?
I don't think this would apply to that situation because this is talking about activating the signal change on the side of the light signal, pushing the button to
Well,
make
but
the lights
if an
change.
adult's doing that to aid children crossing and does it multiple times, would that still be an issue? And I don't know that crossing guards are even used anymore. It's been a long time since I was in school, but.
Well, I see what you're saying, but the main thing that's being prohibited by it is for a purpose other than trying to cross the street. I suppose that if there's a bunch of them to
Yeah.
get across the street and it takes 3 cycles to do that, I think they'd be okay.
Okay, excellent.
Is all the 2 cycles is doing is kind of creating a rebuttable presumption of a
Excellent.
violation. This is the part that makes the ordinance applicable to drivers as well, for a driver to block traffic or slow down or stop or whatever in the middle of the street in order to respond to a pedestrian. It makes them equally liable for violations, the same as the pedestrian.
I read that and forgot it, thank you.
What it does not apply to, congested areas does not include parking lots or alleys. It does not apply to a person legally using the crosswalk to cross the street. An exception is made for law enforcement and emergency services, persons engaged in like street repair, maintenance, things like that. In situations where the city has issued a special permit, an event permit. Those are exceptions that are listed in the ordinance. And finally, the penalty for this, it's an unclassified misdemeanor, which is standard for a city ordinance. Under our general penalty, the fine for that is up to $499 and up to 30 days in jail. You have any questions? That's a summary of what the ordinance is, I suppose.
Regards to drivers not stopping for pedestrian, if there was, say, a doctor thought somebody might be in distress, or just an average citizen thought the pedestrian was in some type of a need of care of some kind, any provision for exception on that so they wouldn't be ticketed?
Well, I don't know that they would fall under this because they're not, what they're doing is not for the purpose of facilitating a transfer or anything like that. I mean, there is an exception for emergency medical service and stuff like that, but that's not really, the situation you're describing is not really what this ordinance is.
I understand.
It's talking about a transfer between a pedestrian and a driver.
Okay.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lester, do you want to hand out your sheet and talk about that a little bit?
I'm just handing around here. Basically, all of this is just, especially for the first meeting, just some talking points that I put together to help elicit discussion. I tried to kind of break it down into what I see as you know, the core issues that we need to address. And those are the items in bold, which would be, you know, safety issues, enforcement, assistance to the homeless, mental health, addiction, the firefighters and their campaign, and then we've already kind of talked a little bit about the legal issues. So, Mr. Chairman, this is just for talking points to kind of help drive the discussion. Use it as you wish, or if you don't want to, that's fine as well.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to put that together. I think to start off, I'd like to open it up and just hear what everybody's concerns are. Where do you think there is an issue with this so that we can sort of get a list of things we need to work through, put together? You know, I think you've done a great job of highlighting some of the things that we obviously need to discuss as we try to sort out how the best thing to handle this is. But you know, part of the other aspect of that is, well, we do have folks that genuinely are in need of help. How does our community react to that? What are the processes in place? How do teams work together, organizations? And where, in addition to, you know, making sure we have this ordinance crafted properly, where do we need to strengthen partnerships we already have or build new partnerships in the community to make sure that folks in need have the ability to get the help that they need and make their lives better? So with that, I'll open it up. If anybody has initial concerns, let me know. We'll get it written down and we can start discussing it. Yes, sir.
I do a lot of statistical work and familiar with a lot of different types of statistics. And one of the things that I want to make sure that I understand is that that Luther brought up the issue of crash rates or the highest areas where crashes are. Now, for me, I want to caution everybody on correlational type studies because they don't necessarily mean cause and effect. And I just mean it this way. Are the majority of pedestrian accidents from panhandlers? Or are they from the general people, just kids running across the street? Because I don't know. Because my concern would be is obviously I do believe that we do need to have some type of accountability. There's no doubt about that. I would be concerned if it's the streets. If we said 21st engage, your panhandlers are just going to go over to Sonic and get off the street. They're going to go over to Sonic and they're going to hang out in that parking lot, or they're going to go to parking lots. Number one, I would be concerned about that. I don't know with the victims being were the accidents a cause of office or the driver distractions because of this group of people? I don't know. I would like to be able to go back because I don't know what crimes these people would be coming to jail for to see if we've seen anybody coming to jail for that. Now, part of my philosophy is not criminalizing those who are in need of help. If I do know that there was a deal of true need versus not need. I don't know how that would be defined, and I think it's legitimate. If I don't know how Sedgwick County, I think he said which, I don't know how the city of Topeka. I can tell you, though, if this became a real push, I could see this being very costly to the city of Topeka if people started going to jail for these types of things. I mean, it's certainly from the standpoint of, the way we work with the city is they certainly we don't charge the city the whole full per diem rate. If we started seeing an increase of those people coming to jail, so like that, for a great deal of time, and I don't even know what the average length of stay is for a person with the city of Topeka either. It could be a definite impact financially to your taxpayers. I don't know necessarily that you want to put everybody in jail, but I mean, I think that's what this committee's for, is to find out what you want to do. But I guess the questions that I would have is that are the crash, and whether they find cause, are the crashes related to being distraction, or are they general pedestrians getting hurt? And I would very much be concerned that your restaurants will become the places they go to. If you want off the street, though these are intersections that have a lot of things, I think you'll see them in the Target. If you're at 21st and, or what is that, 21st and Wanamaker, you could see them in the big parking lot of Target and all of them and Sonics and stuff like that. And I think they'll just move off the street and just go into the parking lots. At least that's.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
If I can address a couple of those things.
Sure.
You bring up a good point. One thing that I learned in my criminal justice classes and from Dr. Heim, of all people, actually. I talked about the theory of ice cream sales and robberies.
Correct.
Typically, and that was the example that you gave, and there really isn't a true cause and effect. So I'll have to let Luther kind of jump into that, but I think you make a good point there. It also brings up two issues, one of which I do have down here that I wanted to ask Luther about, and this is as good a time as any. The one ability we do have of when it does move into, if it is a restaurant or a private parking lot or something like that, those are private areas where those individuals can be told that they cannot solicit there, they cannot be there, no different than currently. The question that I do have, though, is a little bit in, Luther, in regards to what you were asking, though, in the movement is in regard to the necessity of having specific locations. I mean, and I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no, I'm just simply asking the question, isn't the act of distracting the driver inherently dangerous? I mean, that being the case, why does there have to be a correlation between congestion, a correlation between arterial, those type of things, if in fact the act in itself is inherently dangerous?
Well, I'll try to answer your questions. What's at play here is some pretty significant underlying legal issues with First Amendment law. And the legal department, when we drafted this, we were pretty careful to look at those and consider those in the way we worded this. A couple of concerns when trying to regulate something like this is the first is panhandling is recognized as speech. It's protected speech under the First Amendment, and we could not, well, if we did, any law that we would pass prohibiting panhandling would likely be held unconstitutional. So the kind of the first principle, I guess, is whatever we put together as an ordinance, it has to be content neutral. We can't discriminate based on the speaker and what the sign says. It has to apply to everybody. The second principle is it has to be narrowly tailored. That's a First Amendment law concept. When they talk about a court reviewing one of these laws, is they use a principle called narrowly tailored. And the gist of that is does it leave ample alternative avenues to engage in this conduct or speech? That's why we get into limiting it to only certain streets and only certain areas, because that's where our data is suggesting those locations are the most dangerous. And I get the concern about pushing them somewhere else, but that's kind of the point, is because this area is dangerous, we can't prohibit what they're doing, we just need them to go do it somewhere else, because people are getting hit and killed in these locations. So those are kind of the concerns at issue here, is that it has to be neutral, apply to everybody, and it has to leave open alternative avenues for people to engage in that conduct, because it is protected speech.
Tell me, I assume obviously you've reviewed the Wichita statute, obviously probably in depth. Tell me, between our statute and their statute, fundamentally, are there any differences?
I'm not sure I can answer your question right off the top of my head. I know we used it as a guide, but I don't have the Wichita ordinance in front of me. I apologize.
Does Wichita point out, does Wichita's ordinance specifically list certain locations that is prohibited?
Yes, it's very similar structure, but there's probably some differences in wording and stuff like that. But the overall structure of the ordinance and the use of terms like arterial and congested area,
Gotcha.
those are very similar.
Thank you.
Question for you. Where folks are standing on the side of the street holding a sign, how does our sign ordinance not solve that problem already?
Well, because it's a person. Our sign ordinance is talking about sticking something in the ground or affixing it to an object and leaving it there. And a person is not within how we define a sign in our sign ordinance.
And a person with a sign?
Again, it's a person primarily, because a sign means a specific thing that is attached to the ground or a pole or something like that and left there.
What if they're selling mattresses or lemonade? I mean, we're inducing a driver to stop. There's an exchange, perhaps, of information, if nothing else. Here's a flyer on the mattresses down the road.
Well, it's not so much what they're saying.
No, not challenging, I'm
It's
just
what
saying.
they're
I'm just
doing.
curious now.
If they are advertising and not engaged in any kind of exchange between the driver and the pedestrian, they would be okay. That's why the first prohibition on this was kind of complicated, and I broke it into 3 parts, because they're going to have to do each of those 3 things in order to be a violation. Somebody advertising a going out of business sale or something like that is not going to be covered by this.
Unless there's a flyer through the window for the driver, that's an exchange of something.
That would be, yeah.
Information. Okay.
Okay. Reverend Faker.
Councilman Lesser asked my question already.
Excellent. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And this is probably going to throw a wrench into everything. But I've listened to this when it was first brought. I've listened to the discussion. I've talked to people about this. And it's a problem, definitely, because on one side you have people concerned about the distraction. And then the other side, people are really concerned about not being able to help people who legitimately need help. And right now, it seems to me that most of the conversation is about how to restrict an activity that can be distracting to a driver. But little has been offered yet about what do we do about these persons who are in our community who need help. Granted, there's an argument that some have a true need and others are taking advantage of people's good nature. And I know that the department has CIT, crisis intervention teams, and does that not include that kind of activity when there's an opportunity to assist rather than arrest? That's what that CIT is intended to do?
Most of those personnel will deal with the homeless community, yes.
Yeah.
In addition to, of course, field operations.
Yeah, and I imagine trying to address homelessness, poverty, and being down on your luck is just as complicated as trying to figure out where congested areas or arterial roadways are at risk because of this activity. But I think a fair share of our argument, or discussion, rather than argument, should include that as well, because like Mr. Cole said here, I don't know if there's a real correlation between the accidents and the activity. I don't know, do we want to send people to jail for something? I don't know, it keeps ringing in my head, debtor's prison. I know that's silly and old, but, you know, it just, if you're down on your luck and now you're more down on your luck, what's that do for our community? So that's the one thing I ask, because I know everybody in here, almost, I don't know the lieutenant personally, but I know just about everyone else in here. We all have a good heart and have good intentions on this, and that the ultimate goal is for the people who need help to get help in a way that doesn't possibly cause danger to the drivers and pedestrians in the community. So I just wanted to throw that out, sir.
And I think that's why this particular committee, in its ability to bring in folks from outside of just the council, is so incredibly powerful. I mean, Mr. Cole's absolutely right. If this ordinance is passed, we're going to displace people. The question is where they get displaced to. And I think this team has an incredible opportunity to sort of nudge that displacement in the direction of where we have resources in the community that can help them. And so part of that is having a process in place. So if one of these incidents happens and the police get called, how do we work with both the jail and, say, the rescue mission to make sure that rather than going to sit in jail, those folks are shuffled over to the rescue mission to receive services that they may need, or over to Vallejo to receive services that they may need? How do we make sure that we get people where they need to be rather than just putting them in jail? And I know like the rescue mission has processes and programs in place to do some of that. How do we make sure that what we have is working well and tied together as tightly as it needs to be to make sure all that happens? And I think this is an incredible opportunity to take a look at that and sort out where do we need more resources, where we need to reallocate things, how we need to make sure the process works in order to genuinely help people. I think at the end of the day, that's what we're all here trying to do. And at the same time, if we can make the roads a little safer, that's great too. Mr. Speaker.
I think part of the understanding of where we need to go is to understand why it occurs. Why do we have people who are panhandling? And that's very complicated.
Yes.
To answer that. There's a reason that it occurs, number one, and then there's a reason that it continues to occur. That reason that it continues to occur, will that, by passing an ordinance that says in certain areas that it will not be allowed there, does that mean that it's going to go away? Will that force people into receiving a service or knowing about a service? I would say probably a very small percentage. I believe that our understanding of people who have chosen to survive or in some situations take advantage of the community in this manner, and I'm not going to suggest what the percentage of that is. There are people truly in need and people who are not, who are taking advantage of other people. However, they've chosen this particular system to be able to gain resources. And so are they going to then change that system just because they're not allowed to do it here if they can do that same system somewhere else? If they go to a parking lot or they just go over the next street, maybe they're Opportunities are going to be less, but I don't think that that's necessarily going to have people want to take advantage of an opportunity that might be what we would consider more productive or healthier for them. So I think getting an understanding of why they've chosen this and what it is that we might be able to offer them differently, I think that really is going to have to be a part of this equation. Otherwise, I think what we're doing is we're addressing a community safety issue, which is good, important. But I'm not sure, again, we have a correlation much here between panhandling and people getting hurt. And so we may be wasting our time in that regard on community safety in the big picture. If the real issue is we have people outdoors who are doing this kind of activity and we're wanting to change that, I think it's a broader discussion than just outlawing it.
And I think there's two important points to have. You know, on one side, so the ordinance is not to dissuade panhandling. It's to create safety zones where the public is safer when they're driving and crossing the street. In the same conversation, though, I do think it's absolutely critically important to take a look at what resources we have that are available, and if there's an opportunity for us to help somebody get out of that lifestyle, then to make sure that we have everything ready to go to help them with that. So within the context of it, and it's two parallel conversations, right? Because you're absolutely right. You know, if somebody really, really wants that lifestyle, and we tell them they can't do it on Street A, they're going to move over to Street B and continue to do so. And the folks that are choosing that, you know, there's not a whole lot you can do. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But the folks that's their only option, and they're doing it out of necessity because they can't come up with anything better, it's absolutely critical that we as a community make sure that we have safety nets and things like that in place to help them get better at life. I mean, that's, as humans, that's, I think, our duty to help our fellow man and woman where we can. So, absolutely.
I do have a question for Luther, and this is probably a goofy question because I'm not an attorney. Not saying you're goofy. Don't be goofy. Can you, I know it's the First Amendment, and I've read that. Can you restrict, can you put time limits when people can do this? Can you say, if it's not, if you can say you can't go over a street, but can you say between the hours of here and here, you can say all you want, but from these hours to these hours, you can't?
That's an additional concept under First Amendment law, is a time, place, and manner restriction. And yes, there are, the ability to do that does exist. I think where you would run into a problem, though, is where you were singling out a group like panhandlers. You're going to have a content-neutral problem because you're picking on one group based on the content of their message, their sign. They're asking for money. So you're not going to have a valid time, place, and manner restriction if you're not content-neutral.
I hear what he's kind of coming up with, though. I know we're listed in here in these talking points, like the boot campaign that the community is very familiar with. Putting time constraints on them as well, would that make it across the board fair rather than just?
Sure, as long as that same time, place, and manner restriction applies to everybody.
Correct.
And it's got a
Sure.
purpose for it that's based on safety concern, then yes, you would be valid that way.
I mean, if I was, you live in the city, and I do agree that if we said go away from these areas that were businesses where people are shopping and you move it and they move closer to pedestrians, and I think pedestrians may get worried about, am I going to have somebody, are there going to be an increase of, prowling and lurking? Is there going to be, thefts or whatever? I mean, I don't want to be an alarmist on that kind of stuff. I mean, I get what you're saying exactly, that I just didn't know from the practical standpoint of, is saying, this here, but, and then I've also read on where cities have had areas where they've had homeless camps in cities or stuff like this, and then you're going to have to start dealing with the issue of, well, it sounds like a good idea, but not in this street. I don't want it here, but not in my area. I mean, we talked about, that happened with that halfway house kind of deal.
Right.
But, yeah, I just didn't know. I mean, I was on board with just saying if there's a restriction, it applies to everybody. Everybody, look, if you want to do something, it's, jails have been, sometimes there's jails that will say inmate activity is from 10 o'clock at night till 11. And they don't violate the law, but some people we don't do that, but they will get into them and say, well, look, come on, is it 11 o'clock at night till midnight really when they want to work out? Well, their jails are still populated, that's when and they don't, they're meeting accreditation standards, they're meeting the law, and I'm thinking, I just didn't know if there was a way to, if it just applied to everybody, if it was times or something that maybe, not during the busy times, not during, whatever, but I don't want to add more complications.
I guess the best way I could explain it is there's different levels of scrutiny that the court will apply. And if you've got a law that is not neutral, that's targeting a specific group, they're going to start with strict scrutiny, and there's a presumption that that law is unconstitutional.
Sure.
If your law, though, is content neutral and is applying to everybody, they're going to do an intermediate level of scrutiny, and that's where your time, place, and manner restrictions come in, and they look at, is it narrowly tailored, is it related to a legitimate government purpose?
Sure.
So,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Mr. Bersinger and then
I would defer to the council.
Mr. Lesser.
Just a couple things. And this is just my personal opinion. The three areas that as I've reviewed all this stuff that are important to me that the ordinance intent to address is safety of the roadways for the drivers and the individuals who are there, providing help for the individuals who are in need. That's the other key piece for me. And through the process, my hope is it gives us also the opportunity to engage with these individuals. If they are there and in violation and an officer has to approach them, that we have the tools that we set up to give them, whether it's detox, whether it's work program, whether it's housing, we can have this engagement that we can truly help these individuals that truly need help. And then it also, the third point is also the economic impact of it. And we have to look at the fact of especially on arterial of the business owners that we have that have approached me in regards to it has had a negative effect on their business, on some of their tenants, their safety, all those different things. And those are three core things that are important to me and none any more important than the other, quite frankly. The concept of moving, that the individuals are going to move, I don't doubt that at all. But then the next question comes is in regards to no different than anything economically, where then does it become, and I'm talking more so for the individuals who aren't necessarily in need, who are truly doing this, as Barry and I've talked about, that are then getting in their car, in Walmart Park, and they're not homeless, Where would it push them? That's what we then have to look at is, where then, if they aren't there, where is it economically more viable for them to go? And I don't know where that is. The restaurant situation for those individuals, again, we're talking private property. Even parking lots still private property. They can't be there. So I see that as a positive, as a negative. If it does, it's no different. If you remove the resources, then where do they go? And if there's no resources, then does it go away? And does it then also give us the opportunity to help the people who really do need help? I just throw that out for food for thought.
And I think that's actually a segue. If you two gentlemen would speak a little bit about when you get someone that comes to your places where they're in genuine need of service, can you talk us through that process about how you're able to engage with them and help them, and what resources and tools are available from your standpoint?
I'd be glad to do that, sure. First, a quick question, and trying to understand the narrowness of it, Luther, and I appreciate that. So I'm just trying to understand the outside of it, what it's not. Okay, so what if sometimes you've seen people on the street who offer windshield washing services? They definitely stop traffic. There's a transaction. The driver's involved. There's consent. I mean, would that be and not at all being critical, just asking, what's the outside of this thing? Because if someone decides, well, if I can't just stand there and ask for something, but I could provide a service, and get paid for it.
Well, I believe that would be covered under this ordinance
Okay.
because it's an exchange between the driver and the pedestrian if they're doing it in the roadway. Nothing's prohibiting the driver from pulling off into a parking lot or a parking area.
Right.
Engaging in it there, that's fine.
So not too much different than somebody handing out free pizza certificates to drivers on the side of the road.
It's that exchange between a pedestrian and a
exchange.
driver at one of those locations that we identify that.
Okay.
That's what we're looking at.
But if the cheer squad is having a car wash in a parking lot and they've got kids out there with signs, you could still pull in the parking lot and get your car washed and everybody would be happy.
Yeah, that's fine, because there's no exchange happening on the street between the driver and the pedestrian.
Excellent.
And then follow-up question, do we have any information to suggest that anybody, a panhandling, and not to single out any group of people, but a panhandler, if I could use that term, that any of those folks are victims of people who, are there people who handle panhandlers?
Yes.
Okay. So the other thing, that which leads me to say, I appreciate the fact that the folks here are willing to consider the individual stories of who might actually be and what are their needs. But I would defer to Barry to start describing what they do, and I could follow that up. But
I think one thing that's good to note is both Vallejo and Topeka Rescue Mission have assertive outreach to go out on the streets together as well as separately to engage with individuals who are homeless camps, abandoned homes, and including panhandlers. With that said, the majority of time when you offer those services to them, they're going to tell you that they're not interested in those services. That said, for what's called chronic homelessness, if in fact that individual is homeless, the national statistics will say it takes an average of 70 positive contacts before that person will trust you enough to receive the services that you have. So you've got to be out there a lot. You have to have consistency in what you're doing and be able to back it up when the time comes. So that's what makes it very difficult. Then you add on to those who are not necessarily chronically homeless, who are making a really good living, so to speak, of taking advantage of those who are generous. However, if we do get somebody who wants our service in this regard, then we assess to the best that we can with our Street Reach program to determine what it is that they need at that moment. It could be that they need Vallejo crisis, so we're going to take them over there. It could be Vallejo recovery for alcohol or drug issues. We've had a really great relationship with Vallejo to where when they have bed space, we can expedite someone getting into that service on the spot without having to go through maybe normal procedures to be able to do that. That said, those beds are full almost all the time. We both have limited resources now. We shelter over 2,000 different homeless people a year. As it is, most all of the time our bed spaces are full. And so if we do bring somebody in off the streets, they are of a nature where they're chronic. There's probably mental health issues there. There are other issues there that make it very difficult for them to come into a very crowded environment. And one gentleman that we were working with that panhandled off and on, lived in a car, had been out there for 7 years. When we finally did have that 70th time or that magical number and he came in, what we found out is that he couldn't tolerate being around other people. And so he preferred to be outdoors and preferred that particular lifestyle. He also had mental illness and had a organic issue with brain lesions and whatnot, which made it very difficult for him to have any other kind of situation. So we finally resigned ourselves. Our best way of helping him is outdoors in his quote-unquote home, where he was more comfortable until we could get services lined up, which took an additional 2 years. So that kind of gives a picture. We have shelter. We have programs for people who are able to take advantage of education programs, mentoring programs, all the way from 30 days to 2-year programs. That works for many of them, but not for everybody, and that's not everybody that we're talking about here, I think, in a large part.
Can you talk real quick about, so when you come across an individual that isn't homeless but just masquerading as one, somebody who's literally just there taking advantage of the generosity of other folks, how do you guys handle a situation like that when you come across it? Do you have a not really a test, but do you have a way you can sort of figure out that they're not really in need of services?
Well, one, we don't spend a lot of time trying to reach them if they don't really need it. So once we do determine that, and occasionally you will find out that there are people passing through town, and the word gets around. I've been in the work for a long time. I've actually been panhandled by the same person multiple times, and they forgot who I was. And so they have the same story every single time, but they're different locations. And I've said, don't you remember when you had the same story at another place the other day, and that's all you needed was a little gas money to go to Lawrence? Same story. So when you have those kind of things happen, then what you do is you just put out the word that this particular individual is probably not legit, and so we will not spend time servicing them anymore. Oftentimes, it's up to private property owners if they want to file a complaint for that person doing that on their property, and most of the time I found out in Topeka, they're not interested, unless it's creating some type of problem for their business or whatever. So we don't spend much time on them. There's other situations where we've just thought we better keep an eye on somebody for a little bit, and we saw them panhandling, we saw them get in a car and drive off, or we saw them actually go into a home that we would later on find out that they weren't homeless. We don't spend a lot of time on that, though. We spend times on the ones that we know are a little bit more legitimate, best that we can tell. There are certain signs of people talking to themselves, or those kind of the way they dress and whatnot.
So you're able to, I shouldn't say somewhat easily, but you're able to identify the folks that at least you feel would benefit from application of services as opposed to the ones who.
I think there's kind of three types here, to simplify it. One is a person who is really taking advantage of the system. They don't need the help. They could be working. Maybe they are working, and this is extra spending money, I suppose. To somebody who's very, very chronically homeless. They have a number of issues that are putting them out there on the streets. And to the person who maybe could benefit from one of our services, but they choose not to because they're doing it their way. As long as somebody is generous enough to come by and give me cash that supports my addiction, or whatever the case might be, then why would I want to come to a place that says we're going to try to help you deal with your addiction? There will be quite a number of testimonies, I'm sure, if we get further into this, of people who will say, actually, people helping me out of their generosity helped me to stay intoxicated or stay addicted to methamphetamines because now I had a way to buy it. That's a difficult argument, but it's a legitimate argument. So people that are not in need at all, people are so far out there that they really don't know where things are at this point, to people who are truly homeless, that because we're helping them in this way, it could be actually harming them. That said, I would not advocate that we stop that. I would advocate we give them choice. I'd advocate that we educate the community more about, your helping might be hurting, but we're not saying it is, because we don't know.
So how would an ordinance like this that would encourage people not, in a more aggressive way, not contribute money to folks like that, how would this affect each of those groups, in your opinion?
I think, based upon history, where city councils have addressed this issue before, this is going to create quite a controversial discussion in the community. Some people are going to be very, very grateful that this is going on because they don't want to see it. They're tired of it, especially business property owners. It's affecting their business. They're going to be very, very happy that at least it'll not be on my block anymore. Understand that. Respect that. By and large, a lot of people are going to think that the city, I believe, if looking at history, is being very punitive against people who are in need. And council members will be getting a lot of calls. City manager will be getting calls. Mayor will be getting calls to say that this is wrong. So I think, how do you address that? I think that adding on, which Councilman Lesser has identified some of these in the handout here, is that if we're going to do something proactively, the city's going to do that in regards to restriction, that you have to balance it out with opportunity. That's what's being discussed here. The problem is we're going to have to create some new opportunity because the current opportunities are pretty well maxed out. Vallejo.
Yeah, I can give you a
TRM.
list, but yeah, it's.
We're going to have to add to this equation, and that might not be a bad thing. When you add to these particular areas, there's always a dollar figure attached to them. We don't have a wet shelter in Topeka. By that meaning that we don't have a place for someone who's intoxicated, who is homeless, to come into. to sober up. They can go to Vallejo if they want to go to in treatment, but if they just want to come in off the streets, we cannot have 40, 50, 60 children who are homeless and families around a person who's fallen down on top of them at night. That's just our reality. We've got such a mixed crowd, so we're what's called a dry shelter. That said, we have exceptions for life safety issues. But a number of these folks that are in the streets, panhandling, are going to have issues of substance abuse, and that's what really we could use in this community. And other additional things along those lines, but there will be a cost to that. But if the city's willing to partner together to look at those areas with providers, then the community's going to look at it a little bit differently than just being a punitive decision.
And I think that's why we have this committee. I mean, this is a tough issue, and if we're going to solve this, then, the first thing to do is to start by talking about it, frankly and honestly, and that's part of why we've invited you all to be part of this at a committee level instead of just, as somebody who comes to provide testimony, because it's a serious issue and it requires the partnership of all of you guys. Right now, if somebody's in a situation like that, I expect they wind up in jail, and that's absolutely not the place to begin a mental health treatment center. I mean, that we need to come up with better solutions for that, and they are expensive.
So I think one decision for this committee to consider would be a composite package, so to speak, of what we might be able to do. And again, I think from just the practicality of it as well as the public opinion of it, it would be good to be able to offer that to the community. Not say, well, 5 years from now, we're going to look at phase 2 of this possibility where we might have some more services. Until then, we're going to outlaw it on Wanamaker or whatever.
Well, and that's why we have representatives from the fire department and the police department here, because when we encounter an individual in this situation, it's not enough, at least for me, to write them a ticket and move on. The issue is we need to figure out how do we ascertain whether or not they need help, and if they do, what's the process by which to get them help and ensure that there's resources there to provide that. If it's someone who doesn't really need the help, that's just choosing to do that for extra money and that sort of thing, then I would agree that's a whole other ballgame. But we can't put a program in place where we don't have the opportunity to help folks that genuinely need it. So.
And really talk about, working upstream with prevention programs and early intervention programs. And if you permit, I'd take just a few minutes and run through a list, but I don't want anybody to get the idea that the list is open, that a lot of these programs are full, they're maxed out, there are kind of rules and some things like that. So, and I don't want to just sit here and, stump for more resources, because I think the important thing about a group like this is the attitude, why it's being done, and I applaud that. And so I don't want to use this as a forum to ask for more funding. But it is true that we could always spend better money upstream than reacting to a problem here and now. And I would start by complimenting Chief Duke and Chief Cochran, who brought up the notion again of behavioral paramedicine, how to get health care on the street to people now. We have a support employment program for persons with mental illness. We have, of course, 24-hour detox and crisis care, and the detox is nearly always full. It's a walk-in, first come, first serve, and that kind of thing. And we have a Navigate program to help, identify people in their late teens, early 20s who are starting to have problems and, work ahead of, before a time when they might not have resources. We have a community medication program. We deliver psychiatric medicine to 65 or 70 people a day, every day, twice a day, morning and night. Which, all these things are preventative and interventive and helpful. We have a Housing First pilot that I think has just been approved by the state that's going to allow us to serve people coming out of detox who might ordinarily go into homelessness, and we find them a place to live for up to 30 days, get them some resources, do some things like that. So the state of Kansas is buying in. City of Topeka has been very helpful with our co-responder program, basically social workers on the street with police officers and sheriff's officers, and a number of housing opportunities through the city that you all support. So there are a lot of things going on to help people. We just, always looking at how can we do that better. So there are some options out there. I think that if part of the answer going forward is, okay, well, you're going to pass an ordinance, but what about the root causes that Barry brings up? Then I think we could have a list of here's what we're doing, here's ones that are meeting needs, here's some unmet needs, and where do we need to go? So a lot of nice things going on out there. So it's another opportunity for me to say thank you to the city and the county, but also to say we are doing something. It's just, there's some unmet needs, like you bring up sobering beds is the program you're kind of talking about. We don't have a psychiatric boarding facility, and you know, there are a number, in fact, there are a number of programs in Bexar County, Texas, and San Antonio that are a real awesome opportunity for police officers and other first responders to, you know, drop people off at a place where they can be assessed, their needs can be met, just kind of an on-demand service. And so we might take another look at that Bexar County program. And in fact, Leon, the fellow who started that program, has been up here at Topeka a couple times. So
Wonderful.
some good stuff going on, but there's always some unmet needs, especially if we're going to reduce one kind of behavior. People with a true need are going to show up in another area, and their needs may become even more acute. But that's kind of a quick rundown, Mr. Chairman. of
Well,
kind
and
of
so
what
one
we're
thing I
doing now.
would ask that you all do is, let's assume for a moment that this does pass as written. Within the existing framework of the services that you all offer, where are the existing loopholes? Where within the framework we have now are we going to see immediate issues? And what can we do to sort of patch those holes right away? And then what's the long-term position we need to actually get that to be a better program? So if it passes, what would we need to do right away to fulfill the need? And then what's the longer term? You know, building that program, the WET program, would obviously take some time to do. What can we do now? And then how do we build that program? I mean, I'm assuming you guys have some idea in place of what would it take to put that together. I think we should talk about that as part of this and make sure that, you know, if we have short-term plans and long-term plans, and how do we get there? And then the flip side of it is take a look at this in a more holistic view, and, you know, is this the right move for the community? You know, if this isn't the right move, then what is? You know, we have an obvious need, and there's obviously some public support behind it, or we wouldn't have gotten this far. So if an ordinance that is targeted at traffic safety is not the solution to solve this problem, what is an option to solve the problem? I mean, there's absolutely nothing that says we can't come back with something completely different. This is what's been presented to us as the governing body in response to you know, some public interest in solving a particular problem. That doesn't mean it's the only option we have. It's just the one that's been presented to us thus far. So two things to sort of think about as we move on to the next meetings and that sort of thing is, you know, what could we do to solve the problem given the existing framework that's been proposed, where the loopholes, the issues we're going to run into, because I wholeheartedly agree there will be. Let's try and think through those and what we can do to solve those. And then the flip side of it is other ideas, better options.
I think it's a tool, so.
Wonderful.
Could I
Yes, sir.
just leave there one question?
Yes.
So I make sure that I understand this correctly. In my business as a penological interest, this ordinance is being suggested because of a governmental best interest in government to reduce high areas. We're trying to improve safety and security in this by just, no matter what the we're trying to just reduce stress. That's the business interest we're in, is we have high traffic areas of accidents. So we're trying to come up with ways to reduce fatalities and injuries.
Yes.
So I think the ordinance on what it is not a bad ordinance. I mean, we're talking about high traffic areas that you're seeing. I mean, it's a no-brainer to me. You have areas in town that are seeing you have to do stuff in. If one way to, it kind of reminds me of the seatbelt stuff. We always suggested you didn't take seatbelts down. People we're having fatalities, and you make it a law. But I guess my question is that this is a good business interest, that we are identifying areas of fatalities and injuries in our city, and we have to do our best to address those. And it's in our business interest to try to reduce the distractions there. So that makes sense to me. I think the other issue is that we do see there's a need in our community. And Bill said it best. I think the best direction is take some time to see what they do in Bexar County and the resources they do, where law enforcement or people able to, and CIT, are able to see somebody who's homeless and being able to see somebody who's in need, to roll up on them. I appreciate that, Lou. To roll up and be able to say, look, you shouldn't be in this area, or we notice you're in there, what's going on, can we help you? And Barry's right, you're going to have to gain the trust that. But I mean, the ordinance, I mean, it's to reduce distractions, it's to reduce injuries, which I think it is public safety. I mean, that makes sense to me. I think Luther's right. I think you get in trouble with the First Amendment stuff if we try to somehow mesh the issue of, well, we're trying to reduce public safety by stopping these people to talk. And wouldn't that make, I mean, that's where we want that. So, or being able their freedom of speech. I mean,
Mr. Chairman, I would say again, I think it's good public policy that we're talking about this,
Yeah.
and the direction we're going. I think a well-written ordinance could be another tool, and but on a much larger scale, when the DUI laws were changed, which came from social policy and action, cooperation between law enforcement and others, that produced a need in the community for, alcohol and drug information school for people popped with a DUI or a minor in consumption. It produced a need for more treatment beds, more education activities within schools and other prevention activities like at PARs. So on a smaller scale, I think what we're doing with this, could be doing, is giving society another tool to say, okay, let's keep people safe, let's get them, but I think it will produce a bit of an increased need. I don't know how much, but I think we could add it to the list of things that government's doing to provide for public safety. So
Excellent.
it's another tool the way I see it.
Mr. Lesser.
And circling back around what you and I talked about earlier as well, is I do see it as the ordinance as one issue. And the fact of whether or not there's a correlation between these accidents and these, it really kind of goes back to my other statement, is it is a distraction. So this is a bad area for that. We need to lessen
I agree.
that as well.
I think that's the purpose of the, yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. And another thing then I that is equally as important to me is, and Barry always has to correct me on this because we've talked about this scripture, but you corrected me like 15 times.
Sorry.
No, you told me. I still never can remember. But I've talked to you about teaching a man to fish versus giving him fish, and you've always filled me in on where that was at. But I say that, and I see this also as an opportunity that we can give these people resources. And I would not support this. And that was, I took some criticism as I brought this up, as Mike, remembers. I took some criticism as there were some individuals that wanted to move on doing it right now. And we were not ready. That would put a burden on you guys, on law enforcement, would put a burden on, we were not ready to do that. And we have to have, just as you said, we have to have all these things in place before we move forward. No matter how clear-cut the legislation and the ordinance is, that we're on good standing for that, whatever. We have to be on standing in that we are ready to be stewards to these other individuals for what their needs are, and we're not just filling your house, because that helps nobody. And so that's kind of my intent, Mr. Chairman, is us creating that. I look at this as an opportunity to help people as much as it is to eliminate a problem of safety as well.
Reverend Figure, you mentioned that, and it makes perfect sense to me, that there are folks that are panhandling out there basically at the forced behest of other people. And obviously, if you're doing that under duress, we wouldn't want to penalize you. How could you foresee us working around that particular issue?
I think that there's different offerings that we could help people with. I mean, if they in fact are in need, how can we meet that need in a different way rather than risking public safety or risking the generosity of other people? There has to be a bit of a campaign to educate the community on a better way to do it. We have to have that better way in place. Some communities around the country have begun work programs to where outreach teams will go out and engage with the panhandler or the unsheltered homeless person and say, we have a job for you today. And if their person is able-bodied, then what they can do is that they can pick them up and they can take them to a job. They get paid that day, and if you want to come right back to the same spot tonight, that's fine. You get something to eat, you have some money, which might enable them to use it for drugs or whatever, but you got to start somewhere. And but also can be mentioned during that transaction is we have an opportunity for shelter for you. We have an opportunity for substance abuse treatment and whatever. Again, it's that relationship building. The person's getting some resources in their pocket, but they're also learning how to work at the same time. So Portland, Maine has a really good program. San Antonio has a pretty good program. We've looked at some of those over the years.
Excellent.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm going to have to be leaving the meeting here. But a couple of things were said that, and you mentioned it, and so did Mr. Feeker, and that is, I think that it's important for the community to know what this committee is talking about. For us to do our work not in a vacuum, because I really believe that already there are a lot of people making assumptions that are incorrect, and I don't want somebody worrying about this affecting gravel driveways. But
Oh, dear.
the thing is, we're talking about two very clear things, and we're giving good consideration to all of those aspects and not just looking at one thing, and we're considering all the unintended consequences that come from our actions and recommendations. I think you're very good at expressing yourself, and so is Mr. Lesser. I think that making sure that when we're talking about this to the media, that they understand that that is our hope and direction, and we're not one-minded and focused on our actions in this committee.
I think that's important, because this committee was charged with reviewing a specific ordinance, but at the end of the day, we've put together this team because there's considerable fallout from implementing that ordinance if it's not done with the appropriate other programs alongside it. And the last thing we want to do is create considerable fallout in the community around what could be a good idea if we don't have everything else in place to take care of what will happen from that. So,
Question.
Yes, sir.
First of all, I agree with Brian in regards to if it's a public safety issue, it's a public safety issue. If it's good for the community to keep people alive, that's great, regardless of whoever's on the streets, driving or otherwise. Does this particular ordinance contain language that talks about if you do engage with, law enforcement engages with an individual, that if they are homeless, that they are then instructed to take them to a shelter at that point, or is that in a different ordinance?
I defer to Luther. I don't believe it does, but that's certainly something we could add if necessary, I believe.
No, that is not in this particular
this one,
ordinance.
so-
That's only in the camping.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Luther, I'm sorry. I was going to ask that same question. Is it possible for it to be in this one, or is that a policy thing that we can do internally?
I'm not sure how we would work that in, because this ordinance is not intended to be focusing on homeless or panhandlers. This is, in order to write something that was neutral, it's applying to everybody. And many of your pedestrians that or drivers that would be subject to this ordinance, they're just simply not going to have any need for that.
I understand, I agree with that. I think that's, I think it's going to be confusing enough, as we've talked about panhandling, and we're talking about community safety, that's not the same thing.
Right.
Yes.
And what you're attempting to do, which I believe is very wise, is to broaden this out into a greater community safety issue.
Yes, sir.
And if you had that in there, then it would be pointing back to a particular group of people, which I don't think you want to do in this regard.
No.
We could, however, lean very heavily on the city manager to craft internal policies that could help those folks in need.
Mr.
Well-
Chair, sorry.
Go ahead, Chief.
Yes,
That's
sir.
one of the things of the program that Chief Cochran and I have been working on with the community mental health paramedicine, we'll call it, is when we be able to do that, and we're supposed to get that looked into with the Board of EMS, if we're allowed to transport somebody to a specific facility, or do they have to go through the emergency room to get that, which we're trying to stop. So that's one of the things.
Excellent.
And also, since the 500 other part of this gorilla falls onto the fire department, and the MDA collection, the boot fill and everything, I mean, that's been going on for 60 years. Last year, they collected about $34,000 here in Topeka that went to local kids to help them and take them to summer camps and so forth. And I did some research nationally on cities and how they have approached this. A lot of them, like Topeka, the firefighters, they're out in the high visibility vests, you know, so they're not just walking straight out into the street, you know, that sort of thing. I understand what Luther was saying about those high incident areas where people, pedestrians and cars, and that's being taken into consideration. They're trying to come up with ways either to go to the likes of Walmart or Home Depot or somebody to ask them for permission. If
And there were
this keeps
only
going, if this-
2 areas that overlapped.
there was 2 areas that overlap.
Okay.
But nationally, I think there's only been 1 firefighter killed
Wow.
in collecting for MDA over the last 60 years. And that was an intentional thing because the young man that hit him had mental issues and deliberately drove at him because he got fed up sitting in the line waiting to get through the stop sign. So,
That's too bad to hear.
but whatever this body decides, we'll work the best we can to get through this so the firefighters can maintain collecting for MDA. I just know, reading research nationally, that usually their collections, if they do not go to those inner busy areas, it drops to 50%.
Excellent. Thank you for the information.
Real quick note
Yes,
related to CIT, and law enforcement officers here in Shawnee County are particularly well-trained in CIT, but a part of CIT is assessing an individual in just a matter of minutes. Is this a person with a true need? Is this a person who maybe, doesn't have a true need? And then having some of the resources in place to respond. So, one of the things that is happening proactively every day is the law enforcement officers are assessing the needs of those individuals, and sometimes with a mental health professional at their side.
Excellent.
So, put that out there.
And Luther, correct me if I'm wrong, but they would have discretion whether or not to ticket or to transport to a facility if they came across it.
Yeah.
Okay, so they would have discretion. So that, at the end of the day, it's giving everyone the tools they have to get folks the help they need and protect public safety. If there's no other discussion, then we'll move on to public comment. Excellent. Well, I think we've got some excellent takeaways from this to talk about. We'll have, obviously, we'll have some future meetings, which we'll set some dates in a moment here. But the intent today was to ask a lot of questions, which I think we've done, and really get folks to start thinking about what we need to come up with and how we're going to address a very serious issue in our community. So with that, move on to public comment. If anybody in the audience would like to say a few words. Councilwoman Hiller.
Thank you. When I applaud you all, this is a great committee and great discussion. I just want to throw out a few points. You all have covered some really great stuff. I've tried to pull it together a little bit. One of the things, I'm speaking as both a citizen and as a council person, if that's okay. I live in central Topeka, in neighborhoods that are in the grayed out area on that map. I also represent them and have worked in these issues for my entire career. On the council, I have done a lot with transportation and issues of crash data and so on. I think one of the problems that I've had with this proposal as put forth is the correlation kind of issues that Mr. Cole talked about. And in my experience, there is actual crash data collected for every crash that occurs, whether it's at least all the automobile ones. So I assume that we have crash data for the pedestrians as well. Every single one that I can think of that was an injured or killed pedestrian didn't have anything to do with panhandling. It was jaywalking at 19th and Gage, imprudently, or whatever you want to say. So it does seem like it would be worth it from looking at this from the safety point of view to go ahead and gather that crash data and look and see if there are any indicators. I mean, further as an example, we were looking at the 17th and Washburn intersection one time when there was an opportunity for some grant money, and they actually pulled all the crash data thinking, well, were all the crashes drunken students coming home at 2 a.m. or was it, what was it? And there was absolutely no correlation. There was no consistency in license plate sources or nothing in that crash history to then build a pitch that there needed to be safety money for that intersection, basically. It's fascinating to look at it, but I think we should if we really seriously are talking about this as a safety issue. In terms of panhandling itself in the district that is proposed as grayed out, people don't panhandle on the street because they don't have to. They panhandle on the sidewalk downtown or along Southwest 6th Street or wherever. And so the idea of the correlation, again, with the street really isn't there, I don't think. So if there were data, again, that would really support that. Otherwise, certainly we ought to look at safety for safety's sake if there's a problem. But if there's not, and what we really are wanting to talk about is the fact that people don't think it looks good when people with signs are standing on the corner on Wanamaker. They don't like it. If it's that we're worried more about a motor vehicle safety, actually, of motorists stopping in traffic when people weren't expecting them to and getting rear-ended or being delayed through a stoplight cycle or something like that. It's okay to be unhappy with almost anything, at least to start out with, and look at your problem. If there are people that don't trust that there's been a lot of word on the street that some of those folks on Wanamaker or on 21st Street are, have nicer cars than the observers do, and they've got kind of a racket going. They don't trust them, and they don't want people to get hoodwinked by somebody who's not really in need of money. And so they don't like that. Yet at the same time, I think if you want to call it a problem, is that as has been discussed, people are really caring and generous in this community. And if somebody's in need, they do want to help them. And we have enough of a public comment that, no, you should not pick those people up and put them in your car and take them to the rescue mission. And the police might not take them anyway. And we're not sure about Vallejo. And so you don't want to put them in your car, and you don't want to take them home, so just give them some money. And so you all have talked about a lot of the related issues to that, but looking at the fact that people really do want to help, and why do they stop? And so how do we problem solve around that, which you did some of today? So I wanted to share just a couple of solutions that have come up in my experience and in talking about this issue since it came up at council. One is that creating a culture of caring and referral in our community. Going after that and supporting that, because it's really, really strong, but also coming up with a culture of, well, if you want to help people, what's the best way to do that? And one of the ideas that's come out of an experience that I had a couple years ago, I was in Vietnam and Cambodia. And the real problem was children panhandling. And the kids had it down to an art. And those two countries are really coming back from some very difficult times, as we know. And so with the tourist trade, which of course I was in the bigger cities and then in small communities with small groups, the structure that they'd done, and it was working, was they said, we don't want to encourage panhandling. We don't want you to give money to those kids. Tell you what, we've adopted a school. If you want to do something, donate money through the tour group, or if you want to give school equipment, do that, and we will stop and visit that school. You'll see where your money's going. You can feed that desire to help is too strong for us to think we could talk people out of it. But if that can be channeled into an appropriate way, donating to the rescue mission, donating to Vallejo, donating to Doorstep, perhaps even having coupons in hand, so rather than giving somebody cash, giving them support and a direction on where the help is available, knowing that they could get it. The transportation that you all brought up is a real problem there, because how do you get the person from that street corner to that location? So these starting conversations that you've had about some way, and that the chiefs have been having, to me, in my experience, is really key and a really something to pursue a little more. Also, there has been a lot of conversation about the work alternative programs. That's really been appealing. So I would certainly encourage us to make sure we really have a pedestrian safety problem. It would be solved by this before we go on too much with the proposal at hand, but nonetheless take on the issue. Oh, I forgot one of them, and that is that the signs themselves, again, when we look at cause and effect, we do have a sign ordinance that says there aren't supposed to be any signs between the sidewalk and the street. And so if there's something we need to fix, if our sign ordinance, because if you have metal legs on a sign, it's illegal, but if there are human legs on that sign and it's there in the same place every day, it isn't. That might be a place to look to get humans carrying signs out of locations where right now it's not legal for anybody else to put one. Because of sight triangles on corners, because of distracted driving, there are all the reasons that we know of that are behind the sign ordinance that might be a place to work on that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just a concerned citizen, but I'm also affiliated with the American Legion, a nonprofit, and I also side with the fire department. And I've also worked with the homeless shelter in California for over 10 years on the board and directly working with the homeless. So I can see that side too, exactly what he said. Homeless people, for the most part, do not panhandle. If you've gone here, have any of you actually gone out, maybe the police officers have, in the city here, and like, I live over off of 37th and Humboldt, the Walmart over there. Have you ever sat in the parking lot and watched some of the people that sit there at that corner, wait till they leave, they get in a nicer car than I've driven, you follow a couple of cars back and watch them go into the same neighborhood or a neighborhood down from me, and they're living in a house nicer than my house. And, you know, most homeless people, when we worked with them in California, the few that did do the panhandling, once we got them in and gave them some other things and resources for money, they didn't do it, because most of them don't want to do that if you've got the resources there. The other thing is, I have been researching, spending my own time at night, because I work during the day. State of Michigan, they outlawed it throughout the state. Any and all panhandling and or boot boxes. Well, in 2017, there was a big uprising over everyone, and I do have, now, if y'all would like to have a copy of it, their new House bill that they passed in 2017 for the state, where there's regulations for nonprofits that want to raise money on the street corners. They have to have proper insurance. They have to have letterheads from whoever they are, whether it's the fire department, the American Legion, the VFW. They have to wear proper attire. They cannot restrict the roadways with signs. They have to stay on the sidewalks or a wide enough center median. And I think it's in Kentucky. They had the same issue. Well, how they solved theirs, because it is, you know, freedom of speech, they require anyone that's panhandling or collecting for a boot box, they have to have a lanyard that is registered with the city. It has to state where they're from and what they're collecting for on the lanyard, specific lanyards, and even the homeless and or just regular panhandlers have to have the same thing. And they'll say on there, they're panhandling. They're an individual, they're panhandling, and they have to wear the lanyards. If they're on a corner and they are not wearing their lanyard and have their identification, the police can ticket them. San Diego, California, they ticket people that are panhandling on the corners, except for civic organizations, fire departments, nonprofits. Same thing, they have to be fill out permits, they have to have insurance for liability, and they have to wear visible clothing. There's ways to do it, and they have time restraints. They can't do it at night, they have to do specific hours, bad weather, they can't do it during the winter if it's in an icy area like what we have here. So, you know, you guys are talking about homeless people and panhandlers, but on the other section, you're kind of like chopping off people. Did y'all watch the Red Couch? We were on the Red Couch a couple weeks ago. We went and did a boot box at 29th and Wanamaker. We raised $2,200. We worked all day long. We took that $2,200 and $2,201 and gave that to the PTSD department at the VA. Why? Because even though the VA is a government entity, you'd think they supply those veterans with everything they need. They don't. And that exact amount we raised, the 22 represents 22 veterans every day that commit suicide. The one represents the one that they can push when they call the VA to get immediate help. So it's important to us that you don't rule out the nonprofits, because that's the only way we can get a lot of money to help. Last year, Post 400 went around and did loot boxes, solicited other donations. I believe we gave the rescue mission about 60 Christmas stockings. And this year, we've already contacted Mars. Mars wants to work directly with us because we want to help the children at the rescue mission. So I would be glad to keep doing research for you guys. I do it on my own time, even though I work for an attorney's office and he knows what I'm doing, but I do it on my own time because it's important. And I also don't want to see the firemen lose out for muscular dystrophy. And I think that's about it. I just want you to be aware I'll be at every committee meeting. I tried to get on the committee meeting, but I don't guess I was important enough, so thank you.
Well, thank you for your comments. I've written down the couple of states you referenced, so I appreciate that. Any other public comments? Okay. So the next order of business is to sort out when to meet again. How much time do you all need to go back and take a look at some of the items and things like that that we mentioned today?
Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to remember as well, what was our due date we were supposed to come back to?
I'd have to look, but generally it's 90 days after our first meeting. So if we meet again in 3 weeks, is that sufficient time for everyone to gather some of the information they needed?
What are you hoping to accomplish in that next meeting?
So everybody's got ideas to take back and take a look at. I'd like to have all those brought back, you know, some of the loopholes and things like that we talked about, issues with the existing safety net. And then I'd like to do a little bit more research on, you know, some of these items that the gal mentioned that other states are doing, and sort out whether or not we're going down the right path, that sort of thing. Also, the alternative idea. If this ordinance is not the solution to the problem, what is a solution to the problem? If there is another idea out there to do, and then if so, if we're going to move forward with the existing, where we need to fill holes and that sort of thing. So,
Chairman Jensen, can we look at the second week of August?
that looks fine to me. And we don't have to necessarily pick a day today. I'm more interested if that's enough time for everyone to do the research that they need to do.
Second week of August is going to be almost a month.
On the 6th.
I don't know that I would.
You'd have to meet again. It'd have to be on the August 7th agenda, sorry, to make your 90 days.
Well, it should be 90 days from our first meeting.
No.
It's 90 days from.
90 days from the.
Ah, okay. Well, we'll have to extend it then.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
You just have to bring it back up.
Okay.
But you have to make the report.
Okay.
I don't know what date-wise, but I don't know that I would want to go out any longer than 3 weeks.
Yes.
Right.
Well, 3 weeks from today would be July 30th. So, or actually, yes, that would be, yeah. So,
I would suggest then we look at July 30th, and then move backwards if July 30th is not.
okay. Well, I just want people to have enough time to put their thoughts together. And what I would do is have Liz reach out and pick a date with everybody. If that's sufficient time, then that would at least give her a target, so. All right. Any other comments, questions before we adjourn?
Thank you.
Well, guys, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I think we have some exciting work ahead of us, but this will be an excellent chance for our community to see what we can do to help people. Thank you.
Thank you. Well said.